So what could peace look like? And what role would the U.S., Europe, and NATO play in any security guarantees? Admiral James Stavridis served as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, and in a recent piece for Bloomberg imagines what would happen if the U.S. pulled out of that alliance. He's also a partner at the Carlyle Group, and he joins us from Florida. Admiral Stavridis, thank you so much for joining us. Just an unimaginable scenario, even having to write about the U.S. pulling out of NATO a few months ago, and yet here we are. Let me begin, though, with this important week here of meetings between the United States and the Ukrainians. The American side says that their goal is to, quote, create a framework for a peace agreement and an initial ceasefire. Based on everything that we've seen publicly from the White House and all of its ire directed seemingly just towards Ukraine, with serious ramifications and holding back intelligence and weaponry, how concerned are you about what may or may not come out of these meetings tomorrow?
I'm very concerned. We all should be. This is trending in a very negative direction for Ukraine. Let's be hopeful, and hope is not a strategy, but let's be hopeful that with the arrival of Secretary Rubio, which I think is a good thing, there is a possibility that we can get back on track, get back to the idea of the minerals deal, which I think is very attractive personally to President Trump. And if we could get back to that sort of where we were, Bianna, right before the explosively bad meeting in the White House, that would be a win. What are the chances of getting back to that? I'd say they're better than even at this point, but certainly a lot of concern out there, to include, final thought, the strikes that Russia has been launching against civilian targets and against critical infrastructure in Ukraine.
In terms of the outcome of the U.S. withholding military aid, experts like yourself say that won't be noticeable on the battlefield for at least another few months, and hopefully the U.S. will start again supplying Ukraine along with the Europeans with that needed aid. But the intelligence that the U.S. has frozen, how much can we say that has played a role in some of the gains and inroads that Russia has made even over the last few days, specifically in the Kursk region?
Yeah, your premise is exactly right. And just for viewers, yes, obviously the heavy-duty military equipment, the bombs, the missiles, the guns, all that is critical. But if you stop and think about it, even as someone who's not involved, shall we say, in the profession of arms, you would quickly realize, where are you going to point them? What are the targets? How are you going to be certain you're not going to cause collateral damage, for example? All of that comes out of the intelligence and the imagery. These are the photographs that come from overhead sensors like satellites, which you're showing now. I've watched thousands and thousands of hours of this kind of footage with my targeteers during strikes in Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, and elsewhere. It is the lifeblood of military operations, intelligence and imagery. And that is having an immediate impact, I think, in the Kursk region. You showed a map of that a moment ago. This is a key bargaining chip for Ukraine. And so far, it appears since that intelligence was shut off, we're seeing real gains by the Russians. And oh, by the way, their evil creatures from North Korea, 12,000 soldiers, are part of this Kursk offensive. We've effectively blinded the Ukrainians, even as this assault has begun. And final thought, Bianna, the intel about incoming missiles against civilian targets, if that has been shut off, certainly you can lay the deaths of Ukrainian civilians alongside this decision. It's a bad one.
So how do you then try to explain or wrap your head around what we've seen taking place, Russia only stepping up its attacks against Ukraine over the last few weeks, President Zelensky appearing to come with real concessions and offering some solutions that he thinks could lead to at least a temporary ceasefire in land and sea, and yet you hear President Trump continue to say that this is going to be more difficult to get Ukraine to come to the table table, that Ukraine really has to make some concessions. Secretary of State Rubio said that he will be listening to see what concessions Ukraine can make. And we don't hear that type of language as it refers to Russia. Yes, there was a one-off about additional sanctions, but that hasn't been actually implemented at all. And we know, I don't even know what impact additional sanctions would have, since so many sanctions were leveled against Russia when this war initially began.
Yeah, it's clearly a complete U-turn on U.S. policy. Previously, we were supportive, in my view, as we should be, of Ukraine, a democracy backed up by all of our European allies who are the victims here, who were invaded by a dictator, Vladimir Putin. Now it feels as though we've done this U-turn where our presumption is that Russia is somebody who we can kind of support in their approach in the negotiations while we put all the pressure over here on the Ukrainians. You know, Bianna, we used to talk about maximum pressure campaigns applied to who? To the Iranians. Now we're applying maximum pressure and using those terms against the Ukrainians. I think it is a miscarriage of justice to do so. Having said all of that, let's get both parties to the negotiating table. Let's get a ceasefire without giving away any more Ukrainian territory. And let's see where the negotiations go. But ultimately, your point is 100% correct, which is the U.S. is going to have to put a lot of pressure on Vladimir Putin, and he will have to make some concessions alongside those that we envision for the Ukrainians if we're going to get to a deal.
Back to your piece on envisioning what the world would look like if the U.S. does exit NATO. I want to quote from your article, and you write, the Europeans' foreign and defense policies would rapidly split from those of the U.S. Instead of confronting China alongside Washington, they might see greater economic and perhaps even military cooperation with Beijing as a hedge against growing U.S. alignment with Vladimir Putin's Russia. More European nations will likely join Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Europe may be far less inclined to join with the U.S. in pressuring Iran over its nuclear program and instead seek economic advantages there. Mind-boggling to envision that type of multipolar world where the Europeans, who had been more aligned to China over the last few years, but really took a step back because of pressure from the United States to do so, may find itself back in that position, if not even more reliant. And now on social media, you have Elon Musk saying that the U.S. must exit NATO, some elected members of the Senate suggesting the same online. How real is this hypothetical at this point, but one that at least led you to write a thoughtful piece like this?
Yeah, a thoughtful perhaps, but certainly for me, heartbreaking piece as a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO to write it. I believe in the alliance. I believe in the transatlantic bridge. But let me tell you, it's kind of an aha moment for Europeans as they look at this U-turn in foreign policy that we discussed a moment ago. And they are coming to what I fear is an accurate realization that at least under a Trump administration, they can't count on solid support from Washington. So we ought to remember, Bianna, and you know this, you know Europe quite well. We ought to remember that Europe is not without cards in this game. They have the second largest economy in the world collectively, 22% of the world's GDP. The US is 25%, they're 22%. They have the second largest defense budget in the world collectively, more than China, more than Russia, probably around 500 billion. US is 900 billion. So they have a lot of capacity. They have excellent defense industrial based firms, everything from Airbus to Thales to Leonardo, many others that Americans won't know, but 8 of the top 20 defense firms in the world are in Europe. So they've got the capacity. The question is, to conclude, do they have the will and do they have the unity? I think given what they're seeing from Washington, that is underway, and that could lead to a crack in that transatlantic bridge and the end of NATO as we know it.
And you bring up an important point, and that is the economic impact, too, and how Europe will have to rely more on its own defensive companies as opposed to what we've seen over the past few years, and that is the United States being the main source for procuring weapons for Europe. This has long been viewed by the Biden administration as an investment in the U.S. economy, specifically in the defense sector, a reinvestment. President Zelensky also said as much when he spoke before a joint session of Congress, saying this isn't charity, this is an investment. What happens to the United States if all of a sudden the growth engine, at least on defensive weaponry, shifts to Europe?
It will diminish our own defense industrial base. Just to put the numbers on your excellent point, today, about 75% of European defense spending goes right to American companies. They make about 25% of their military equipment in Europe. They are actively creating funds, allocating resources to spin that around so that they can be the ones producing 50 to 75% of their own military equipment. I think they'll get there in 3 to 5 years. And that is moving fast in the world of defense procurement. And then final point, and I think you underline this, but I just want to hit it again. When we talk about providing aid to Ukraine, military aid, we don't send them like a container full of cash. What happens is we spend that money here in the United States, in our defense industrial base, and send them those products. Guess who's going to take that market over? Oh, by the way, guess who's going to get the mineral deal if we walk away from Ukraine? So there are sound economic reasons we ought to stay engaged here as well.
Really important conversation. James Stavridis, thank you so much for joining the show.